In early September of 1977, 26-year-old Lois Gibbs held her son's hand as they left their house in Niagara Falls, New York. Michael was just 5 years old, and it was his first day of kindergarten, and as soon as they reached the front steps of the house, Michael broke free from his mother and ran across the front yard. Lois smiled at her son's enthusiasm as she adjusted her oversized glasses and tucked her brown hair behind her ears. Michael's father was already at work, so it was just the two of them walking the few short blocks to 99th Street Elementary School. And as they walked through the neighborhood, Michael looked up at all the smokestacks that dotted the landscape. He pointed out one of them and proudly exclaimed to his mother that that's where Daddy was. Lois smiled at her son and nodded. Niagara Falls was a big blue-collar city full of factories like those, and they were where most local people were employed, which included Lois's husband, who worked at the local Goodyear tire plant. It was hard work, and Lois appreciated everything he did for their family, even if he always came home smelling absolutely terrible. As Lois and Michael continued their walk to school, a neighbor who was out on their front porch called out hello and asked if the little boy was excited to be starting school. Lois knew this woman. She had a son the same age as Michael, but the best answer she could muster to this neighbor was just a nod and a smile, and then immediately Lois looked down and began fiddling with her necklace, which was something she did whenever she felt anxious. Truthfully, Michael was very excited about school, but his mother was just a little bit nervous to let him go. Michael was an active kid, but he was kind of fragile. He had asthma and a history of pneumonia and painful urinary tract infections, and these infections really made Lois feel helpless because she actually could not give Michael any medicine. Aspirin upset his stomach, and he broke out in a rash whenever he took it. Now, Michael was starting school, and Lois worried about all the new viruses and germs he'd be exposed to. Lois's neighbor continued to talk from her porch, and Lois tried to focus on what she was saying, something about the kids playing baseball that weekend, but her anxiety made it really hard to concentrate. And so Lois's mind wandered, and so did her eyes. And as she looked around, she saw kids running up the front steps of the school, and she noticed a man standing nearby the school with a few of the teachers, writing something down on a notepad and asking questions. Lois pointed at this man and actually asked the neighbor on the porch if they knew who this guy was. The neighbor glanced over and told Lois that that guy was a reporter for the local newspaper, which was called the Niagara Gazette. The neighbor guessed that the journalist was there to cover the first day of school. Lois nodded, but then also made a mental note to make sure she totally avoided him. He seemed perfectly friendly, but the thought of talking to a reporter made her extremely nervous. Lois waved goodbye to the neighbor and then watched as her son ran ahead to join the other children. Lois felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Grabbing her necklace tight, she told herself everything would be fine, and then she turned and headed home. A few weeks later, Lois was at home with her sewing machine on the kitchen table, and Michael was at school. Lois was stitching some new drapes for the kitchen window when the phone rang. Lois rolled her eyes, annoyed at having to stop when she was right in the middle of a seam, but she got up and went over and answered the phone. It was the school nurse calling, saying that Michael was lying on her bed in her office. During recess, Michael had become glassy-eyed and unresponsive for just a few seconds, and he seemed to be fine now, but the nurse suspected he likely had a small seizure. Lois's breathing immediately quickened as she asked the nurse to please repeat that. The nurse reassured Lois that while it was scary that he had a seizure, the seizure was short, and Michael was totally back to his normal self now. Still, the nurse suggested that Lois come and get her son and take him to his pediatrician as soon as possible. Lois could feel her heart racing as she slammed the phone on the receiver and then fumbled with her shoes as she raced out her front door. After getting to the school and picking Michael up, Lois took him straight to see the doctor. The doctor gave him a thorough examination and promised Lois that Michael's vitals did look fine and he was not in any sort of imminent danger. He said that while it was rare, kids could sometimes have minor seizures with no obvious cause. But if this happened again, he did advise Lois to take Michael to a specialist. Lois was glad to hear that her son was okay, but she was still very nervous. She already had to monitor Michael's fragile health, and now she had to also watch out for these seizures too. She just hoped that it really was a one-time thing and that this would not become a recurring issue. But unfortunately, the seizures didn't stop. Over the next few months, Lois would learn to recognize when they were happening. There didn't seem to be any particular trigger for them. Michael might be playing in the backyard or doing his homework or watching TV, when all of a sudden his eyes would just kind of glaze over and he would become unresponsive for a few seconds. Then, as if nothing had happened, he'd just be right back to normal. Every time it happened, Lois rushed to Michael's side, holding his hand and reassuring him that everything was okay, but inside she was terrified. She knew it was only a matter of time until Michael's seizures actually caused a major problem. He could be playing on the jungle gym and have a seizure and fall and get hurt, or he could be crossing the street and have a seizure and then get hit by a car. And so finally, when it became fairly obvious to everybody involved that these seizures were likely not going away anytime soon, Michael's pediatrician referred Lois to a neurologist. Lois finally got Michael an appointment in December of 1977, about 3 months after Michael had his first seizure. Lois gave the neurologist a detailed history of Michael's various seizures, and the doctor quickly diagnosed him with epilepsy, a brain disorder that causes chronic seizures. Even though Lois had been expecting something like this, she was still stunned to hear it. There was no family history of epilepsy. Michael had never experienced any kind of physical trauma that might trigger seizures. She'd always fed her family a healthy and nutritious diet. She didn't even allow soda in the house. And so finally, Lois asked the neurologist, what could I have done differently that could have protected my son from this? But the doctor assured Lois that Michael's diagnosis was not her fault. He said epilepsy can have many causes, ranging from a past brain infection to a genetic abnormality. But while this was somewhat reassuring, it didn't really actually clarify for Lois why her son developed epilepsy. To her, it just didn't add up. After the appointment, Lois drove to the pharmacy and picked up the anti-seizure medication the specialist had prescribed. As she did, she still couldn't believe this was actually happening. 2 months later, in February of 1978, Michael and Lois were back inside of a doctor's office. This time, it was Michael's pediatrician. Lois tried to entertain Michael by playing the game I Spy with him, but Michael just sat on the exam table looking pale and very tired. In fact, Lois had never seen Michael so tired and run down before. When the pediatrician finally came into the room, he examined Michael and told Lois that she was right to be concerned. Anti-seizure medication could lower a child's energy levels, but Michael shouldn't be this out of it. The doctor ordered a full battery of blood tests, then sent Lois and Michael home, promising to call them with the results as soon as they came in. And a few hours later, the pediatrician would call Lois, and as soon as she picked up, he would say that unfortunately he had bad news. He told Lois that Michael's white blood cell count had dropped significantly, so much so that the pediatrician hadn't even known what to do and had to go to a colleague to ask for their advice. And so from what he learned, he told Lois that Michael's medication could be what's causing this drop, but he also said that they needed to prepare for another, darker possibility. The doctor explained that Michael might be developing cancer or perhaps a serious blood disorder. When Lois heard this, she just stood there, frozen in the kitchen. It was like time suddenly was standing still. And for a few moments, Lois just didn't say anything. She just stood there. But then finally, she collected herself enough to ask the doctor how they would know for sure what this was. The pediatrician sighed and said unfortunately he did not have the answer, and that Michael would have to be referred to more specialists to get to an answer. As the pediatrician talked, Lois found herself walking over to the kitchen doorway, and she looked in on Michael, who was fast asleep on the couch. He looked so helpless, and she had no idea what to do. At a loss, Lois thanked the pediatrician for all his help so far, then she hung up the phone in a haze. At the same time that Lois was receiving this devastating news, a 26-year-old reporter named Mike Brown stood in the driveway of a wood and brick ranch-style home a couple of blocks away, and as he stood there, he rubbed his hands together to keep them warm against the winter cold. Mike grew up in the area, so he knew a lot about Niagara Falls and the people who lived in this town. And as a rookie reporter with the Niagara Gazette, he was more than willing to go door to door, asking his neighbors for leads on the stories he was investigating. He liked proving himself. Today, Mike was investigating reports of water backing up into people's backyards, even when it wasn't raining. One of Mike's sources said the city had done a lousy job at maintaining sewer pipes, and so they were starting to get clogged. This sort of negligence really got under Mike's skin. Mike strode up the driveway of the ranch home and knocked on the door, and then waited until a petite woman answered the door. Mike introduced himself and explained that he was hoping she could help him. As soon as Mike brought up what he was investigating, reports of water backups, the woman just shook her head in disgust and then invited Mike to follow her into her backyard. Mike followed, thrilled to finally get a lead on this story. He'd been knocking on doors all morning without any luck. It was midwinter, so Mike did not expect to see standing water anywhere because there was too much snow on the ground. But this woman's yard looked like a frozen-over mud pit. The woman told Mike that this was totally typical, that for years her yard had been coated in muck, and in the winter it turned to ice. Mike couldn't imagine how upset he'd be if his own backyard was this bad. Then the woman pointed over to a large circular hole right in the middle of the yard. She explained that they used to have an above-ground swimming pool that was located right there. But a few summers ago, there had been so much standing water coming into the yard that the pool actually began to float. So she and her husband decided to replace the above-ground pool with a cement one. But when they dug the hole for it, the hole had filled up with rancid-smelling yellow, blue, and purple liquids. And so at that point, they decided to just stop with the pool, and they did not end up building one. Mike asked the woman if he could take a few pictures, and she said that was fine, and so he pulled out a small camera and snapped a few photos of the yard, just so he'd remember it later on when he was back in the office. Then he thanked the woman for showing him the yard and said he would be in touch. After that, Mike grabbed a quick sandwich from the nearby gas station and then wolfed it down in his car while he looked over his notes. He had originally thought he'd be researching a story about bad drainage, but as he looked at his notes, he was beginning to think that maybe the problem here was bigger than that. He was certain that the strange, stinking liquid the woman talked about could not be normal flooding, but he would need to talk to more people to figure out what was actually going on. Half an hour later, Mike was back to knocking on doors around 99th Street. After trying a few houses, he finally connected with a middle-aged couple who, after hearing what Mike was researching, said they'd be happy to talk to him. The moment Mike entered their house, he could smell mold. But it wasn't the normal smell of mildew. There was something stale and sort of plasticky about it. A little alarm bell began ringing in the back of Mike's head. Something was really wrong here. The husband, who was tall and had a beer belly, said he wanted to bring Mike down into the basement. But as soon as the husband opened up the door that led to the basement steps, the smell coming out of the basement was this horrible, rancid, wet smell that burned Mike's nose. Mike wondered if maybe this was the same smell that the petite woman he had spoken to at the other house smelled at the bottom of that hole in her yard. The husband and Mike began descending the stairs, but about halfway down, the husband stopped and just told Mike to look around. And so Mike would look around the basement, and right away he saw all this thick black sludge seeping in through the walls of the basement and kind of collecting in the corners on the floor. Mike asked the husband how long their basement had been like this, and the man said, they'd been trying to dry the basement out for about 20 years now. The husband said they had tried everything they could to clear out the sludge, but nothing had worked. The husband also said he called the city countless times to try to get them to help him, but he said nobody from the city ever called him back. This really upset Mike. This couple's living in a house full of this terrible smell and sludge for years and years, and the city had just ignored them. It was becoming clear to Mike that this neighborhood around 99th Street had a problem, and this story was definitely going to be a lot bigger than just a drainage issue. After thanking the couple for their time, Mike headed back outside, looking forward to take a deep breath of fresh air. But when he stepped out onto the stoop, the smell of mold he had smelled inside the house was now replaced with a different, sour smell. He scrunched his nose up and pulled his shirt collar up to his eyes and covered his mouth with his hand. As he approached the 99th Street Elementary School playground, he could taste the sour, chemical-like smell in his mouth. It made his throat sting, which made it hard to breathe, and by the time he reached the playground, Mike was actually wheezing from this sour smell. And that's when he looked out over the school playground and saw several pools of what looked like oil on the ground. Yet school was in session. He could see lights on in all the classrooms as though nothing was wrong. At this point, Mike was furious. It seemed obvious to him that something dangerous was going on here, and the city was clearly ignoring it. Mike turned on his heels and rushed back towards his car, anxious to get back to his office and start writing about what he was finding. A few weeks later, in April of 1978, Lois Gibbs, whose son Michael was epileptic and still very sick, anxiously stood in the school superintendent's office. She was clutching a few of Mike Brown's newspaper articles that had just come out that week in the Niagara Gazette. The articles explained that there were all these horrible smelling liquids that were collecting all around the neighborhood right around the elementary school, and so Lois was worried these liquids were what was making her son sick. Despite her natural shyness, Lois had actually called a meeting to talk over the situation with the superintendent. Lois slid the articles to the superintendent across his shiny oak desk, and she told him about her son's health issues. Even though Michael's health had stabilized and the doctors concluded he did not have cancer, he still wasn't getting better. And so after reading Mike Brown's articles, Lois had become convinced that these black sludge pools at the school must have something to do with her son's illness. Lois told the superintendent that she did not feel safe having Michael on school grounds until these black pools could be investigated by specialists. With tears welling in her eyes, she said that she was worried Michael was going to die. She wanted him transferred out of the school immediately. Across from her, the superintendent kind of dramatically leaned back in his oversized leather chair, and then a look of forced empathy came across his face. And this look kind of unnerved Lois, and she began fiddling with her necklace again, but she pressed on. She pushed 2 doctor's notes across the desk, trying to look self-assured. The superintendent looked at her, and then looked at the notes, and then his look of empathy disappeared, and his eyes narrowed as he told Lois that she was definitely overreacting. All the other students were just fine. The articles were mistaken. There was nothing wrong with the school. Lois tried to stay calm, and so in a sort of shaky but somewhat even voice, she told the superintendent that he was being way too casual with the health of the students at 99th Street Elementary School. But the superintendent just shook his head. No, that was not true. Then he slid the doctor's notes back across the desk and pointed his finger accusingly at Lois. He told her that he wasn't about to upend the whole school for one sick kid and a hysterical housewife. The words felt like a slap in the face to Lois. She didn't understand how anyone working in education could be so heartless, and so she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room. As she drove home after the meeting, Lois felt shell-shocked, her thoughts flipping back and forth between rage and helplessness. But by the time she pulled into her driveway, she knew what she was going to do. Lois was going to reach out to other parents and let them know what was going on. Maybe she'd even tell the whole neighborhood. Heck, she'd go door to door if she had to. If she couldn't get her son transferred out of that school, well, then she was going to have that school shut down before any more children got sick. The next morning, Lois felt butterflies in her stomach as she walked down her driveway. In her hands was a pencil and a petition demanding that the school be shut down. Lois walked all the way to the end of the street, figuring she could work her way back up the street towards home in time for lunch. Lois couldn't keep herself from shaking as she forced herself up onto a neighbor's stoop and knocked on their door. She almost hoped that nobody would answer, but she needed her neighbors to be home, and she needed them to listen. Lois could hear footsteps inside the house, and soon a kind-looking woman about her own age answered the door. Lois smiled and then very anxiously launched into this shaky explanation of what she was doing here, telling the woman about her son and the pools of black liquid on the schoolyard. As Lois spoke, the woman stayed quiet. To Lois, it seemed like this woman might be annoyed with her, and so this made Lois even more nervous, and she began to speak even faster, and then when she was done, the woman just stayed quiet. Lois was convinced this woman would call her crazy and slam the door in her face. But then the woman told Lois that she also had a kid at 99th Street Elementary, a little girl who was diagnosed with arthritis at a very young age. The woman and her husband couldn't understand how their daughter could have arthritis as a little kid, and they'd spent countless hours talking over different possibilities. But now the woman told Lois she wondered if maybe their children's medical cases could be related. Lois felt a combination of pride and sadness as the woman took the clipboard and signed the petition. After that, Lois thanked the woman profusely and let this small glimmer of success boost her confidence as she headed to the next house. A few houses down, another woman came to the door. This time it was someone who was a bit older than Lois, and this woman would tell Lois that her own daughter, who was in her 20s, had recently had a miscarriage, and the daughter's seemingly healthy young husband had had a fatal heart attack soon after the miscarriage. And so the older woman did not need much convincing to also sign Lois's petition. By the time Lois was just halfway down the street, her petition was completely full of signatures. And so Lois was more convinced than ever that there was something wrong with this neighborhood and it needed to be stopped. A few months after Lois got her petition signed by basically everybody in the neighborhood, reporter Mike Brown waited behind one of the trees just outside of City Hall. He'd done this every morning since early April, and now it was almost summer. As Mike sipped his morning coffee and enjoyed the warmth of the morning sun on his face, he noticed the mayor walking from the parking lot to the front steps of City Hall, and so Mike headed over to cut him off. Like he'd done on many mornings before this, Mike started pelting the mayor with questions about the sludge puddles around 99th Elementary School and the oozing basements and flooded backyards that he documented that spring. And as always, the mayor told Mike that all those issues were just a nuisance and not serious health problems, and then the mayor ducked inside his office at City Hall where Mike could no longer follow him. Mike had expected the morning to go this way. He just wanted to annoy the mayor and keep the issue in front of him. Maybe if he badgered the mayor enough, the man would slip up or maybe finally agree to actually talk about these issues. After ambushing the mayor, Mike walked across the street from City Hall to a diner. He walked in through the front door and took a seat at the bar, breathing in the smell of fresh pancakes. A waitress was working the register. She asked Mike if he'd like the usual, and Mike said yes. The waitress brought him a fresh cup of coffee. Then, as usual, she moved the phone from behind the counter to within reach of Mike. Mike thanked her, then used the phone to dial the Niagara County Health Department. At this point, he knew the number by heart. A familiar voice picked up on the other line. Mike didn't know the receptionist by name, but after months of calling and calling, he certainly recognized her voice, and she knew it was Mike immediately. She wished him good luck and then transferred him to her boss before he even had to ask. And as usual, her boss, the health department official who answered the phone, told Mike that the smell and the collecting pools of black liquid were not a health concern. To Mike, it just seemed like the mayor and the health department were in cahoots. Mike hung up and dialed another number. This time it was for the Hooker Chemical Company, which was an industrial company that used to own the land that was adjacent to 99th Street. Mike had already approached Hooker Chemical through more formal channels, and company officials always told him that the black ooze flooding yards all over the neighborhood was not their responsibility. And other than that, they just refused to comment. So now Mike just called them every morning to remind them that he was not going away, and neither was this problem. By the time the receptionist at Hooker Chemical hung up on Mike, a plate of eggs and toast had arrived. Mike thanked the waitress, then drenched his eggs in Tabasco sauce and began to eat. As he ate, Mike barely noticed the neon orange piece of paper sliding onto the bar right next to him. He looked up to see a woman with brown hair and big glasses holding a stack of these orange pieces of paper. They were flyers. He smiled and grabbed the piece of paper she had just slid over to him. Before he could read the flyer, the woman introduced herself as Lois Gibbs and said she knew who he was. She had read his articles in the paper. She told Mike about her son and her neighbors, all of whom she believed had been made sick by the foul, oily liquid that he had written about in those articles. She invited Mike to a community meeting that evening where she and her neighbors would be speaking up about this issue. Mike immediately liked Lois. She seemed like someone who usually tried to blend in, but she had clearly found her voice because she had to. Mike looked down at the flyer and saw there were dates for several other meetings in addition to the one that was happening that night. Mike was very impressed. It was clear this woman was highly organized. And so, after months of working this case alone, Mike suddenly felt a surge of energy. He thanked Lois and promised her that he would be there that night. That night, Mike pulled up outside of a church that was in the next town over from Niagara Falls. Mike walked into the back of the church, then followed a few people downstairs into a big cinder block room with bright overhead lighting. Along the wall was a folding table that had some coffee and a few boxes of homemade cookies. The neon orange flyer said tonight's speakers would discuss a nearby industrial dump site for chemical waste. Mike was eager to better understand how these big industrial plants were disposing of their waste in general. Mike took a seat in a folding chair against the wall and then just kind of kept a low profile. He just wanted to listen tonight. First, a middle-aged, barrel-chested man stood up and thanked everyone for coming in. Then he made a few announcements before ceding the floor to a young woman. Mike guessed this woman was about 20 years old. She had a determined look on her face as she began telling the crowd about this chemical smell that had been lingering in the air around town. She said that this nasty odor was being caused by an old chemical dump site in town that had recently begun leaking. As the girl spoke, she began to cry because she was clearly very afraid of the fact that she had lived right next to this dump her whole life. She would tell the crowd that the area the dump was in was known by the unusual name of the Love Canal. Mike perked up at the mention of this dump site's name. In all the research he'd done in Niagara Falls, he'd never heard of the Love Canal. And so the moment the barrel-chested man stood back up to end the meeting, Mike shot up from his seat and nearly sprinted out the door. He could not wait to get to his office. 20 minutes later, Mike was back in his office, settling in for what he knew would be a long night of research. It only took a few days for Mike, running on almost no sleep, to uncover a horrifying history. A history that almost no one living in Niagara Falls suspected. Everyone knew that it was a factory town with its share of pollution problems, but what Mike had discovered was far worse than that. He learned that back in the 19th century, a New York businessman named William Love built a canal in the area that was meant to be full of water and produce cheap electric power for a city he wanted to build. But he never finished the project, and the canal just sat unused for 50 years like a big ditch. But in 1942, the Hooker Chemical Company bought the old canal to use as a dump site for their chemical waste. Then Mike was stunned to learn that the US military also began dumping chemicals in the canal. In just 10 years, almost 22,000 tons of chemical waste was dumped into the Love Canal. And after that, the Hooker Chemical Company abandoned the dump in 1953 and sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for just $1. But in order for them to buy it at just $1, there was a single condition: that Hooker Chemical Company could never be blamed for a lawsuit, injury, or death resulting from the toxic materials they buried in the canal. Mike could not believe the extent of this cover-up. Clearly, Love Canal is what had made Michael Gibbs, Lois's son, and so many other kids and people in this area so unwell. The elementary school and over 100 houses were built directly on top of thousands of pounds of toxic chemical waste. But Mike couldn't help but smile when he thought about the bombshell that was about to land on the front steps of City Hall as soon as his story about this cover-up was published. He thought of his new friend Lois and the other parents who'd been fighting to get 99th Street Elementary shut down, and for the first time in nearly a year, he felt like they really had a shot at making that happen. After Mike's expose on the Love Canal came out, Lois Gibbs led the entire Love Canal community in banding together and taking their fight to the health department. On August 2, 1978, the Department of Health officially recommended that the 99th Street Elementary School be shut down. More than 2 years later, on October 1, 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed a bill to permanently relocate all of the Love Canal residents to safe neighborhoods. Even still, many of them suffered from lifelong health issues. Eventually, more than $20 million in damages was awarded to the 1,300 residents affected by the Love Canal, which included Lois Gibbs' family. As for Lois's son, Michael, his illness would actually just disappear within just 3 days of leaving the 99th Street neighborhood. And Lois would go on to become one of the most prominent environmental activists in the United States, and in 2003, after 25 years of environmental advocacy, she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But even with Lois's amazing efforts to clean up the toxic waste, it had a devastating effect on the community. In total, between 1979 and 1996, it's believed that 725 people died due to exposure to toxic waste from Love Canal, though their death certificates listed other causes such as heart attacks and cancer. But thanks to advocates like Lois Gibbs and Mike Brown, the Hooker Chemical Corporation was forced to spend almost $400 million cleaning up their enormous mess. On the night of July 18, 2010, 34-year-old former NBA basketball player Lorenzen Wright, along with his old friend Phil Dotson, were driving in Phil's car through Memphis, Tennessee. Lorenzen lived in Atlanta, Georgia, but he'd grown up in Memphis, and so he was back in town to catch up with friends and family, and to really spend some time with his 6 children who lived there with his ex-wife, Shara. Phil and Lorenzen drove down a residential street, laughing together and talking about some of their best memories from when they were younger, and then Phil pulled into the parking lot of a local gym and parked out front. As Lorenzen got outside the car, he had to duck way down so he didn't bump his head on the roof of the car. Lorenzen was huge. He was 6 foot 11 inches tall, with long arms covered in tattoos. And even though he was retired from playing basketball professionally, he was still built like a world-class athlete. Lorenzen and Phil made their way into the gym and headed towards one of the basketball courts inside, where a group of teenage boys were playing a pickup game. And as Lorenzen got closer, he heard the sound of a basketball hitting the rim, and the boys shouting at each other and shoes squeaking on the court as the boys scrambled to grab the loose ball, and immediately Lorenzen smiled, because he loved the sound of basketball being played. Lorenzen and Phil moved around to the side of the court and sat down to watch the game. And as they sat there, Lorenzen began to smile even wider because he noticed his oldest son was one of the young men who was playing. Lorenzen didn't want to distract any of the kids, so he stepped back a little from the court and tried his best to stay out of sight. But at almost 7 feet tall, there was no way for him to hide. And so eventually one of the boys spotted him and shouted Lorenzen's name, and immediately the game came to a complete stop. And within seconds, Lorenzen's son and all the other boys rushed off the court, gathered around Lorenzen, and stared up at him in awe, because Lorenzen was a Memphis sports hero. Lorenzen's friends and family believed that he had been born to play basketball. His father had been a really good college player, and from the time Lorenzen was just a baby, his father had wanted him to follow in his footsteps. In fact, when Lorenzen was only a few days old and had only just come home from the hospital, his father had put Lorenzen's hands around a basketball, because his father believed that the more his son saw the basketball, the more likely it would be that Lorenzen would grow up to become a great basketball player. And as Lorenzen got older, he didn't let his father down. As a young man, Lorenzen had committed most of his time and energy to playing basketball. And when he grew to be 6 foot 11 inches as a teenager, his father and his coaches started to believe Lorenzen had a real chance to play professionally. Lorenzen would have an incredible senior year playing for his Memphis high school basketball team, and then he would go on to play college ball at the big-time program of the University of Memphis. But even on this big college team of all great players from around the country, Lorenzen stood out. And he was so good that after just his sophomore year, he left college, entered the NBA draft, and got drafted by the Los Angeles Clippers. So, at just 20 years old, Lorenzen had become an NBA player and had started making millions and millions of dollars a year. But Lorenzen's biggest joy playing professional basketball, even more than the money and the accolades, had come when he got traded to the Memphis Grizzlies in 2001, and he got to come home and play in the city he grew up in and loved. And even after Lorenzen had retired from the NBA several years later, he had made his home in Memphis with his wife and kids. And in his retirement, he quickly began running basketball camps for kids, he headed up charity events, and basically did anything he could to give back to the city that he believed had given him so much. So, as Lorenzen stood in that gym, talking to his son and his son's friends about basketball and playing in the NBA and anything else they wanted to know, he couldn't help but start to really miss living in Memphis. After talking to the kids on the basketball court for a while, Lorenzen and his son headed out of the gym with Phil, and Phil drove them to Lorenzen's ex-wife Shara's house in a wealthy Memphis suburb. Outside the house, Lorenzen thanked Phil for driving him around, and then he told Phil he'd text him in the next few days so they could hang out again before Lorenzen had to go back to Atlanta. Then Lorenzen and his son turned around and headed up a long walkway past the beautifully landscaped front lawn, opened the front door, and stepped into Shara's large 2-story house. And as soon as Lorenzen walked inside, he heard his other children yelling for him as they rushed to the door to see their dad. And Lorenzen crouched down and wrapped his long arms all around them in a big hug. And that night, Lorenzen just spent time talking to his kids, playing games with them, and catching up with Shara about what was going on in her life. Lorenzen had known Shara since they were in high school. She was the daughter of one of his basketball coaches at the time, and she was a few years older than Lorenzen. Shara was 5 foot 10 inches tall, had long dark hair, and, in Lorenzen's mind, a perfect smile. And when Lorenzen had first laid eyes on her, he thought she was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. And so, not long after they met, Lorenzen and Shara had started dating, and then they had basically grown up together, while Lorenzen went from being a college athlete to playing in the NBA. And for a long time, everything in their lives had seemed perfect. But then, after 13 years of marriage, Shara and Lorenzen had started to drift apart, and eventually they had gotten divorced and Lorenzen had moved to Atlanta. But even after the divorce, Lorenzen and Shara remained close, and they worked hard to give their kids the best life possible. And whenever Lorenzen came to town, he always stayed with Shara and the kids at her house. So, sitting on the couch together, Shara and Lorenzen began to work out plans for their kids to go down to Atlanta with Lorenzen when he left later that week. And then Lorenzen told Shara he really wanted to hear all about the church where she had recently started serving as a pastor. Shara had always been religious, but she admitted to Lorenzen that it was actually really hard to lead a congregation. But she said she did love being a pastor, and she loved the church and the people who went there. And as they talked, again, Lorenzen felt this sudden wave of just really missing Memphis, and now really missing being a part of this family, living with his kids and living with Shara. And suddenly, all he wanted to do was find a way to repair his relationship with Shara and move back in with her permanently in Memphis. And Lorenzen suspected that that actually might be a real possibility because Shara had made it clear that she missed him too. So later that night, when Lorenzen said goodnight to the kids as they headed up to bed, he imagined a time, hopefully soon, when this would be his everyday life again. A little before midnight on July 18th, 2010, so a couple of hours after the kids had gone to bed, Lorenzen crept downstairs at Shara's house in the dark. He slid his hand down the banister, took slow steps, and tried to walk as quietly as possible so he wouldn't wake anybody up. Lorenzen made it to the first floor, he walked across the large entryway, he opened the front door, and stepped outside. And once he was outside, he closed the door behind him as quietly as possible. Outside, Lorenzen could already feel sweat dripping down his forehead. Even though it was almost midnight, the temperature was over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Lorenzen wiped the sweat away and then looked out across the yard, and he saw a car pull up out front. Lorenzen glanced back at the house where his kids and Shara were sleeping, and then he turned and walked quickly to the car, opened the passenger side door, ducked way down, and climbed inside. The driver smiled at him, and then they pulled away from the house. And less than a half hour later, not long after midnight on the morning of July 19th, Lorenzen looked out the passenger side window and he watched the lights from Memphis disappear behind them. And soon after that, the driver turned the car onto a road that was surrounded by woods on both sides, and that was about 15 miles south of downtown Memphis. Then, after looking in the rearview mirror to make sure nobody was behind them, the driver pulled onto a dirt path that led into the woods. They drove the car only a few yards down that path before they stopped and parked the car. Then the driver looked over at Lorenzen, nodded to him, and then the driver stepped out of the car. So Lorenzen ducked down and stepped out of the car as well, and began to follow the driver, who was walking deeper and deeper into the forest. And as Lorenzen walked, he could almost feel the trees closing in on him. Then Lorenzen heard a rustling sound in the trees ahead of them. He and the driver froze for a moment, and Lorenzen strained his eyes to try to see what had made the noise. But it was so dark, Lorenzen just couldn't tell what it was. And so a moment later, the driver and Lorenzen were walking again, but just a second later, Lorenzen heard the sound again. But this time, Lorenzen saw what was causing the noise, and he saw it was coming straight towards him. And so suddenly, in a terrified panic, Lorenzen darted off the dirt path, grabbed his phone out of his pocket, put his head down, and just started running as fast as he could into the dark woods. On July 22nd, so 3 days after Lorenzen had gone into the woods, his friend Phil Dotson was sitting on the couch at home watching TV when his phone rang. Phil grabbed his phone thinking it might be Lorenzen, but he saw Shara was calling. Phil had been waiting to hear back from Lorenzen so they could maybe hang out again before Lorenzen went back to Atlanta, but he knew Lorenzen was busy with the kids and seeing his parents, so he hadn't thought much about it. But as soon as he answered the phone, he could tell something was wrong. Because when Shara heard Phil's voice, she didn't even say hi. She just immediately asked if he had seen or heard from Lorenzen. Phil was totally confused and told Shara he didn't understand because he thought Lorenzen was staying with her and her kids. She said that he had, but a few nights earlier, Lorenzen had left the house to meet up with someone and he had never come back. Shara didn't say anything about this meetup, but Phil secretly wondered if she thought Lorenzen had gone to meet up with a woman. Because since the divorce, Lorenzen often had a few different women he was seeing at one time. But Shara just said she thought it was strange that it had been a couple of days now and that Lorenzen had not called to at least check on the kids. Phil said he agreed and that he would try to track Lorenzen down. So Phil hung up and immediately called Lorenzen. And when Lorenzen didn't answer, Phil sent him a text saying that it was really important for Lorenzen to get back to him as soon as possible. After that, Phil called Lorenzen's mom. And it turned out she hadn't heard from him either, and she was getting really worried too and thought something was wrong, and she was thinking about calling the police. Phil tried to keep her calm, but he knew it was no use. Lorenzen's mom was maybe closer to Lorenzen than anybody in the world, and if she was worried about her son, nobody could say anything to change her mind. After several more hours of not hearing anything from Lorenzen and discovering that no friends or family had heard from him since he left Shara's house a few nights earlier, Phil wound up calling Lorenzen's mom back again, and he told her that he too was now very worried. So Lorenzen's mom called the police in the suburb where Shara lived and reported that her son was missing. But the police response was not nearly as urgent as the people close to Lorenzen had hoped it would be. And over the next few days, there didn't seem to be any real progress made in trying to find Lorenzen. But the police would say that they had no reason to believe there was any foul play involved in Lorenzen's supposed disappearance, which was part of the reason why there was not a lot of urgency here. But Lorenzen's mom kept calling the police over and over and over again, asking for updates and putting pressure on them, and she even contacted the press. She said her son was a former professional basketball star who was 6'11" tall, and so it just didn't make any sense that nobody had seen or recognized him over the past few days. And then finally, on July 27th, so 8 days after Lorenzen had gone into the woods, Memphis police took over the case. Because they had been notified about a 911 call that had been received by a small-town emergency dispatcher early in the morning on July 19th, not that long after Lorenzen had left Shara's house. The 911 dispatcher said the call had been dropped so quickly that they couldn't locate where it was coming from at the time. But Memphis police still didn't understand why nobody had done anything to follow up on that call until over a week after it had been made. Still, there was no use arguing over what could or should have been done, and now Memphis police just wanted to figure out if this 911 call was connected to their missing hometown hero, Lorenzen Wright. And using cell phone tracking data, Memphis police were able to trace the 911 call to Lorenzen's phone number, and they discovered the call had come from somewhere either in or close to the woods, located about 15 miles outside of downtown Memphis. On July 28th, 9 days after Lorenzen had last been seen by anyone, Memphis police officers and police dogs searched the woods and fields in the general location where they believed the 911 call had come from, and what they were looking for were any clues that might lead them to Lorenzen. The sun was blazing overhead, and members of the search party who were looking through an open field near the woods were hot, exhausted, and frustrated that they had not found anything. Then suddenly, one of the police dogs caught a scent, it put its nose to the ground and started off through the field, and the officer, who was the dog's handler, followed close behind. The dog pushed its way through some dried grass, and then came to a stop and started barking. And the dog's handler crouched down to get a better look at whatever the dog had discovered, and when the officer saw what was on the ground, his stomach began to turn. The officer had been at a number of crime scenes, but nothing in his past had prepared him for what he was looking at on the ground right in front of him. He was sure it was a human body, and from the looks of it, there could be bullet wounds on it. But the summer heat and the natural elements had withered the body down to almost nothing, so it was basically just bones and only a little bit of weathered skin, which made it impossible to tell who this person was. The officer stepped back from the body and took a deep breath. Then he called out to the others on the scene, and they quickly joined him and his dog, and then the officer called into the station to say the search party believed they had discovered a murder scene. Not long after that call, forensics and ballistics experts swarmed the area and combed the scene for evidence, and by the end of the day, they had located multiple shell casings from a 9mm pistol not far from the body. However, they couldn't find a gun. And later, the body was finally removed from the field and taken to the coroner. And during the autopsy, the body only weighed about 55 pounds. But dental records confirmed that the victim was the 6'11", 225-pound former professional basketball player, Lorenzen Wright. The news of Lorenzen's death sent the city of Memphis into shock, and some of his former NBA teammates, community leaders, and closest friends like Phil Dotson went on TV to express how upset they were. And all of them talked about how good of a person Lorenzen had been and how much of a loss this really was. But nobody was as heartbroken as Lorenzen's mother. She went on the local news to talk about how amazing her son was and to beg anyone who had information about what had happened to Lorenzen to come forward and share it with police. And so it quickly became clear to Memphis Police Director Tony Armstrong that his department was dealing with one of its most high-profile cases in years. And so Armstrong decided to get directly involved in the investigation because he wanted to make sure everything was done by the book. But Armstrong also wanted to be involved because he had really liked Lorenzen. Over the years, Lorenzen had been a part of so many community programs and charity fundraisers in Memphis that Armstrong had seen him speak on multiple occasions. And Armstrong thought Lorenzen had been a great role model for young people and that he demonstrated how someone should use their money and fame to better the lives of those around them. And so Armstrong wanted to close the case as quickly as possible so he would be able to tell the people of Memphis that police had found justice for one of their city's heroes. But Armstrong felt like his investigative team was already starting at a disadvantage, because the fact that Lorenzen's 911 call had gone unreported for over a week meant that vital evidence at the scene could have been wiped away by the elements, and the killer had been given ample time to travel anywhere in the world before the body was even discovered. But regardless of all that, Armstrong and his lead detectives first had to try to figure out why a former NBA star, who was worth millions of dollars, had gone into the woods in the middle of the night. And so, on August 1st, 4 days after Lorenzen's body had been found, Armstrong and members of his team headed to Shara's house in the suburbs. And after investigators did a thorough search of the house, Armstrong asked if Shara would mind answering some questions to see if she could help police piece together what had happened on the night Lorenzen had left her house and didn't come back. Shara said she would answer anything she could, so she led Armstrong and a detective into the dining room, and they all sat down at the table, and then Armstrong asked her what she remembered about the night Lorenzen disappeared. Shara looked around the room, and then in a quiet voice, she said she didn't want any of the children to hear what she was about to say. Armstrong glanced over at the other detective, and both men nodded and then leaned in close to listen to Shara. And when she started talking, Armstrong's eyes got wide, and he looked like he was in shock. Shara said in a whisper that a little before midnight on July 18th, Lorenzen had gotten a phone call, and he had started pacing around her bedroom, and he was excited and talking loudly to the person on the other line, and she heard him say something about making $110,000 really fast. And at first, Shara had no idea what he was talking about. But then Lorenzen had hung up the phone and walked over to the bags he'd brought with him to the house, and Shara had watched as Lorenzen reached into one of the bags and pulled out a stash of drugs and a wad of cash. She had asked him what was going on, but Lorenzen just said he had some work he needed to take care of. And then he had put the drugs in a box, pocketed the cash, walked out of the room, and headed downstairs. And not long after that, Shara had heard a car driving away from the house. At the dining room table, Armstrong and the detective sat there with stunned looks still on their faces, because Shara's story just made no sense to them.
Armstrong knew that Lorenzen had made close to $55 million during his basketball career, and he owned multiple properties in different cities. And Armstrong couldn't understand why a man with that kind of wealth would have anything to do with dealing drugs, or why he would need to make some fast money. And so Armstrong asked Shara if she was really sure about what she had heard and seen that night, and Shara just nodded and said, "Yes, I'm sure." Then Shara looked around again to make sure none of her kids were close by, and in barely above a whisper, she told them that she felt terrible for what she was about to say, and she hoped it would not ruin their image of Lorenzen. But Armstrong said if she had important information, they needed to hear it no matter what it was. So Shara looked Armstrong in the eye and told him that Lorenzen had blown almost all of the money he'd made from playing in the NBA. She said he'd used a lot of it to help friends and family because he was a good man who could never say no to people who asked him for help. But she said he'd also had trouble controlling his own spending, especially when it came to buying luxury cars and properties. And then she said at least one of Lorenzen's houses was going into foreclosure because he couldn't make the mortgage payments. And so, recently, Lorenzen had begun selling drugs to make ends meet. Armstrong thanked Shara for talking to them and said police would be in touch with her if they needed anything else. Then Armstrong and the other detective headed out of the house, got in their cars, and drove back to the station. And when he got there, Armstrong could not help but feel like this case had already taken a turn he did not see coming. At the police station, Armstrong met with the investigators who had searched Shara's house, and they told him that they had not found anything of interest there. So Armstrong stepped into his office and sat down at his desk. He still couldn't get over what Shara had told him. Her story just did not reflect who Armstrong thought Lorenzen was, a young man who went out of his way to give back to the community whenever he could. But Armstrong knew that the fame and fortune of professional athletes was a world he could never fully understand. And so he put his personal feelings aside, and over the next couple of days, he and his team started looking into any connections Lorenzen might have had to known drug dealers in the area, and what Armstrong discovered shocked him all over again. It turned out that in 2009, a year before Lorenzen's body was found in the woods, he had been mentioned in an FBI investigation involving an international drug smuggling ring that had been operating out of Memphis. Armstrong learned that Lorenzen had never been charged with any crimes based on that investigation, but that investigation showed there was a possibility that Lorenzen had ties to one of the largest cocaine dealers in Memphis. And so all of a sudden, Shara's story started to make a lot of sense. And Armstrong also discovered that one of Lorenzen's homes was indeed going into foreclosure, just like Shara had said. And so now Armstrong believed that the chance to make a lot of money from a drug deal could definitely explain what Lorenzen had been doing in the woods the night he died. So the Memphis police decided to focus in on this new potential lead and to track down the big-time cocaine dealer who Lorenzen had possibly known. On August 4th, 2010, a week after Lorenzen's body was discovered, Armstrong and his team were still following leads that might connect Lorenzen to a large-scale drug operation in Memphis. But while the police were at work, hundreds of Lorenzen's fans, teammates, friends, and family gathered at the arena where the Memphis Grizzlies play basketball for Lorenzen's memorial service. Shara, the children, and Lorenzen's parents led a long procession across the arena floor to Lorenzen's closed silver casket. Each of Lorenzen's children wore a cap with a logo on it from one of the NBA teams Lorenzen had played for, and they all took a moment to say their last goodbyes to their dad. The memorial service was a chance for Memphis to celebrate and honor one of their most loved sports figures, and the service was even televised on local channels for people who could not attend in person. And during the memorial, Lorenzen's mom was visibly shaken and too upset to speak at times, so Lorenzen's younger brother did most of the talking for the family. And he told the crowd how much they all had loved Lorenzen and how proud they were of everything he had accomplished. And then, as he fought back tears, he said he'd always thought his big brother was invincible, so he couldn't believe Lorenzen was now gone. Not long after Lorenzen's brother finished speaking, the mayor of Memphis stepped up to the mic, and he promised Lorenzen's family and everyone in the arena that authorities would track down whoever had killed Lorenzen and they would bring that person to justice. And in the days following that memorial service, Police Director Armstrong felt the pressure building on his investigative team. Lorenzen's murder was now national news, and local news ran stories on Lorenzen and asked for updates on the investigation constantly. And in addition to that, the mayor had just made a public claim that the killer would soon be brought to justice. But all of the added pressure did not mean Memphis police would get any closer to solving the case, and Armstrong's team could only follow the leads they had. So, based on what Shara had told them, and on information from the past FBI investigation, Memphis police continued to aggressively pursue any leads that could tie Lorenzen to the drug trade in Memphis. But they quickly discovered that the cocaine dealer Lorenzen possibly had links to had been in prison at the time of Lorenzen's murder, and police couldn't find any evidence connecting Lorenzen to any other known drug dealers in the area. And so this drug deal theory that police hoped would lead them right to Lorenzen's killer ended up leading them nowhere. And now Armstrong found himself back at square one. And so Armstrong sent his investigators back out to the crime scene to look for more evidence, but throughout all those new searches, they didn't find anything new. All they had were the shell casings that had been found when the body had been found, and that was it. So, without anything to go on, Armstrong just re-interviewed Lorenzen's friend Phil, Lorenzen's ex-wife Shara, and all of Lorenzen's closest family members and friends, but they didn't find anything new in those conversations either. And so, even as pressure continued to mount on the police from the public, the victim's friends and family, and Memphis politicians, Lorenzen's murder case started to go cold, and it stayed that way for years. In the summer of 2012, 2 years after Lorenzen's body was found, his mother decided to go on a public crusade to find justice for her son. Over time, she had watched Lorenzen's story fade from the news, and she had seen the investigation into his murder almost completely stall out, and there was no way she was going to stand for that. And so she started reaching out to local and national press and talking to anybody in the media who would listen. And she told them that she wouldn't just let Lorenzen's memory be forgotten. And she demanded that the police do their job and find Lorenzen's killer. And she said as long as she had blood running through her veins, she was going to keep fighting until her son could finally rest in peace. Now, Director Armstrong saw all of this happening, and he knew that Lorenzen's mom and others in the Memphis community were angry at him and the police for not being able to solve this case. And so Armstrong tried to jumpstart the investigation by assigning a series of new lead detectives to the case, but unfortunately, none of them made any headway. And as more time went by with no new leads and seemingly no hope, Lorenzen's mom started to feel like nobody cared about this case anymore. But then, after years of the investigation barely moving forward, Memphis police would finally catch a break that seemed to come completely out of nowhere. Fast forward to January of 2015, almost 5 years after Lorenzen's murder. Lorenzen's mom continued her media crusade, but she felt like she was the only one who was still fighting for her son. But on a cold winter afternoon, Armstrong was sitting in his office when one of his detectives walked in. This detective had an excited look on his face, and he started talking really fast. And Armstrong looked up and said, wait, what's going on here? What's going on? And the detective slowed down and then just said there was a novel that had just been published that Armstrong had to read. Armstrong stared at the detective like this might be some kind of prank, because he couldn't understand why any new book would warrant this much excitement. But then, the detective told him that even though the book was fiction, he thought it might be connected to the murder of Lorenzen Wright. Armstrong just sat there in silence for a minute. He never imagined he'd have to turn to a work of fiction for possible evidence in a 5-year-long murder investigation. But soon after this meeting, Armstrong and other members of the investigative team read parts of this new book. And what they found didn't provide any hard proof about what had happened to Lorenzen, but it did spark their interest in one particular suspect. And eventually, that newfound interest would help lead to a full-scale relaunch of the investigation, and with more resources behind them, Memphis police would finally uncover who had killed Lorenzen years earlier in the woods. Based on evidence found throughout the investigation, cell phone data, and interviews conducted over the course of 7 years, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Lorenzen Wright on the day he died, July 19, 2010. Just after midnight on July 19, 2010, the killer stood behind a tree at the end of a dirt path leading into the woods. The heat and their own nerves were making the killer sweat, so they wiped their hands dry on the side of their black pants. Then they drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband and clutched it tight. Then the killer saw headlights cutting through the darkness, and they heard a car slowly driving towards them. The car parked a few yards away, and the killer saw the driver step outside. Then they watched Lorenzen get out of the car on the passenger side. Even in the darkness, Lorenzen looked huge, and the killer felt a little bit afraid. So the killer took a steadying breath and then huddled a little bit closer to the tree. A moment later, the driver began walking down the path towards the killer, and Lorenzen followed them. So the killer, at this point, squinted in the darkness and stepped out from their hiding place and raised their gun right at Lorenzen. But the killer hesitated. And when Lorenzen saw this person with the gun standing there, Lorenzen immediately grabbed his phone, turned off the path, and started running deep into the woods. The killer fired the gun at Lorenzen, but they missed, so they took off running after Lorenzen. But Lorenzen was so fast, it was almost impossible for the killer to even stay close. But the killer could see the light from Lorenzen's phone, and so they just kept following that light, and they fired another shot generally in the direction of the phone. Then the woods started to clear, and the moonlight and stars made it easier for the killer to see what was ahead of them and to keep Lorenzen in their sight. And then the killer heard Lorenzen shouting into his phone, desperately asking the police for help. And so the killer fired off a few more shots, and Lorenzen stopped talking, but he kept running. The killer could feel a pain in their side, and they were gasping for air by this point, but they kept pushing as hard as they could to try to keep up with Lorenzen. Then the killer saw Lorenzen running towards a high barbed wire fence that separated the woods from a field on the other side. And the killer just watched, dumbfounded, as Lorenzen leapt clear over the fence in stride. But as Lorenzen jumped, he must have caught his back foot on the fence, because when he landed, he fell to the ground and kind of tumbled forward. And the killer knew this was likely their only chance, so they ran as fast as they could towards the fence, and when they saw Lorenzen trying to get back up, they fired multiple shots through the opening in the barbed wire. And the killer heard Lorenzen scream, and they saw him fall to the ground again. Then the killer managed to get over the barbed wire fence to the other side, and once they got there, they saw Lorenzen laying on the ground, bleeding and struggling to breathe. The killer stood there for a moment, watching Lorenzen. Then they took a deep breath, aimed their pistol at Lorenzen's chest, and they fired. Then they raised their gun slightly and aimed it at Lorenzen's face, and they fired again. At this point, Lorenzen's body went limp, and he died right there in the field. The killer stood over Lorenzen's body, and they felt like they wanted to throw up. But they took another deep breath, turned around, made their way back over the barbed wire fence, and back into the dark woods. And finally, after what felt like hours, but had only been a few minutes, the killer found their way back to the dirt path and saw that the car was still parked there. Then they heard something behind them, and the driver of the car stepped out of the darkness and approached the killer. The driver asked if it was done, and the killer just nodded and said yes. So the driver smiled, climbed back into their car, and drove back home. And when they got inside their house, the driver went from room to room, checking on all 6 of their sleeping children. Lorenzen's ex-wife, Shara, had not actually pulled the trigger, but she was the one behind Lorenzen's murder. She had hired a deacon at the church where she was a pastor to kill her ex-husband. Because it would turn out that Shara was the one who really had the huge spending problem. And she had decided that the $26,000 a month that Lorenzen paid in alimony and child support was not enough money for her to live on, and she wanted the payout from Lorenzen's $1 million life insurance policy and his sizable pension from the MBA. So Shara had decided Lorenzen needed to die. And it turned out that Lorenzen had been right to believe he had a real chance to repair his marriage with Shara and to move back in with his family in Memphis, because Shara had told him how much she missed him. But that wasn't all she had done. In the days leading up to the murder, she had sent Lorenzen a series of sexually explicit text messages telling him how badly she wanted him back. And she had used those messages to lure Lorenzen from Atlanta back to Memphis. And so, late at night on July 18th, 2010, when Lorenzen was staying with Shara in her bedroom, she told him that she had to go meet someone who owed her money. But she said she didn't really want to go alone because they were meeting outside of the city. And so Lorenzen said he would go with her, and that's how Shara had gotten Lorenzen out to the woods where the gunman was waiting for him. Shara knew that Lorenzen had been mentioned in an investigation concerning a drug smuggling ring, and even though Lorenzen had never been found guilty of any crime in that case, she figured if she told police Lorenzen had been dealing drugs, they would discover the past investigation and come to believe the murder was indeed drug-related. And for years, it looked like Shara was going to get away with it. But then, in 2015, she had decided to become an author, and so she self-published a novel. And Shara barely disguised the fact that she wanted people who read the book to believe it was about her own life. And in the book, the main character is married to a basketball player who was abusive, violent, and a terrible husband. So when Armstrong and other investigators read the book, they thought it came off like an attack on Lorenzen. And even though nobody is killed in this book, some investigators thought that at times the book read like Shara was trying to justify Lorenzen's murder. Now, the police were not going to use a work of fiction as proof of Shara's guilt, but her book, and a new round of pressure that came from Lorenzen's friends and family after the book was published, led police to re-examine Shara as a potential suspect. As Lorenzen's ex-wife, she had always been a person of interest in the case, but police never felt like they had any evidence tying her to the crime. But once the investigation was relaunched in full, Memphis police received direct help from the FBI, and both agencies focused their energy on people directly connected to Shara. And in 2017, 7 years after Lorenzen's murder, investigators spoke to a woman who had babysat Shara's children on several occasions, and that woman told investigators that she had once overheard Shara say that she had gotten rid of a gun by throwing it into a lake outside of the city. And so, an FBI dive team searched a lake that fit that description, and they found a 9mm pistol in the water that ended up matching the shell casings that had been found near Lorenzen's body. And that gun led investigators to the man from Shara's church who had pulled the trigger. And eventually, that man led them directly to Shara and exposed her involvement in her ex-husband's murder. The man who actually killed Lorenzen was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 41 years. Shara signed a plea deal, and as part of that deal, she was convicted of facilitation of first-degree murder and was only sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years.
At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in this shack with his father Rivelino, as well as his 2 younger brothers, who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room, only a few feet away. Raimundo and his family were very, very poor. I mean, the shack was very small. It was only composed of 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and also the kitchen, which was connected by a single door, and they were truly like out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money. I mean, they really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, there wasn't really much else to do here, his father, Rivelino, came into the room from the kitchen and he sat down next to him. And the 2 just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers. And as these 2 were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. And so he turned his attention and he looked into the dark kitchen and he saw this dark figure on all 4s quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified, he has no idea what this is, and so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. And at that point, the 2 younger brothers, they've woken up, and all 4 of them are looking at each other like, what's going on? And Raimundo, he says to his dad, what was that? Now, it was clear that Rivelino was very unsettled by whatever this was. I mean, they didn't have pets. There was no other people inside of their shack. Like, there shouldn't be anything alive inside of the shack beyond them. So he doesn't know what it is. He's scared, but he tells his boys, it's okay. It's all right. I don't know what that is, but let's just stay here. We're safe. The door is locked. We're all here. We're safe. And so the boys, they all just kind of trusted their dad, and everybody just kind of hunkered down together and just sat there quietly, kind of waiting to see if they would hear anything else. And for a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Rivelino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. And at first, they couldn't really tell what these voices were saying. They were kind of garbled.
But eventually, they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there, or whatever was out there, was talking about Rivellino. Specifically, they could hear that name. And what they were kind of saying is, if Rivellino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And the moment that all the boys sort of picked up the fact that somebody's out there and they're threatening to harm Rivellino, they're all like, Dad, what do we do? What do we do? And Rivellino, I mean, he's hearing this too, but he tells his boys, it's okay. I don't know what's going on out there, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This is a prank. This can't be real. And so Rivellino told his sons their plan is they're just going to stay put. They're in this room. They're safe. The door is locked. We are going to wait until the sun comes up, and then we'll figure out who did this, who's playing this prank on us. And so sure enough, Rivellino and his sons would stay in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m. when the sun began to come up again. And at that point, Rivellino told his sons to stay put, and he was going to go out there and investigate. And by this point, they had stopped hearing voices. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. It sort of felt like whatever that was, whoever that was, had passed. And so, the tension is gone, and the boys are like, okay, be careful out there, Dad. And so Rivellino, he walks over to the door that leads into the kitchen. He unlocks it, opens it up, and Raimundo, he's craning his neck, looking into the kitchen, but, he can't see anything moving around in there, even with the light coming in. And so Rivellino, he says, okay, boys, stay here. And then Rivellino goes out into the kitchen and shuts the door behind him. And while he's out there, Raimundo and his brothers, they're all listening anxiously, making sure their dad's not in trouble, but they just hear the sound of their dad just clearly walking around the kitchen. There's no commotion, there's nothing. And then a couple of minutes later, Rivellino comes back into the main room where the boys are, and he's got a knife in hand, but he tells them, it's okay, I got this from the kitchen, I'm just in case, there's nothing out here. I'm now going to go outside and just make sure nobody's outside the hut, okay? So again, stay put, I'll be right back. And so again, the boys, they're looking at their dad like, okay, we'll see you soon. Rivellino walked out again into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him. And then the boys heard the sound of the door that led outside open up. And then, presumably, Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder. And this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story, far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father, he opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and as soon as he did, he looked towards the door that led outside, and he saw it was wide open. And he saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out this smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad just kind of walking into this cloud, and then the smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad. His dad was gone. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, like, Dad, where are you going? And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. He just felt like you can't go out there. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. Raimundo sprinted around his house, calling out for his dad, looking everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched this search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search, and then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino, and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. Also, people have no idea what that dark figure was skittering across their kitchen floor the night before Rivellino went missing, or who those voices were threatening to kill Rivellino, or the objects that Raimundo apparently saw floating in the sky spitting out yellow smoke. Nobody has any idea what any of that stuff is. All we know is Rivellino disappeared and 6 months later turned up dead in that crevice. Our next story is called the Bennington Triangle.
West Townshend is a rural area on the east side of Glastonbury Mountain in the American state of Vermont. This is significant because that places West Townshend in the so-called Bennington Triangle, which is apparently one of the most haunted places in America. The Triangle is a loosely defined area that encompasses the ghost town Glastonbury, which used to be a small logging community centered on the eponymous mountain in southwestern Vermont. The town was abandoned at the end of the 19th century after the logging boom died down, so as a result, the greater Glastonbury area that West Townshend is certainly a part of is now untouched, pristine wilderness that even by Vermont standards is incredibly rugged and remote. The Triangle has earned its spooky reputation due in large part to the alarming number of unexplained disappearances that have occurred there over the last 100 years. Furthermore, over those 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of the so-called Bennington Monster, which is apparently this 8-foot-tall creature that roams the mountains of Glastonbury, and some people think that creature is behind many, if not all, of these strange disappearances. On November 23, 1943, 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. At some point during their hunt, the pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him, and so he assumed he must have gone back to their camp. But when Henry got back to camp, it was empty, and Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly, he left to get police. Police show up, they launch the search. For 3 days, they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the third day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Initially, Henry thought maybe he was still alive, so he ran over to him and rolled him over, and very quickly realized that no, Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl, apparently, was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. So the theory became, Carl must have been out here by himself, he encountered a black bear, he fired one shot at the black bear, thinking it was down, he walked over to check, and the bear attacked him and squeezed him and killed him, the end. But not so fast. If Carl encountered a black bear and fired one shot into the animal based on the one found shell casing, that one shot is not going to be enough to put that animal down, or very rarely is one shot going to be enough to put down a black bear. And Carl, being a hunter, he would know that, and he would want to keep some distance with his weapon up aimed at the animal in case he needed to fire again. But even if Carl was really confident that one shot had taken the bear down, well, why would he risk his life by checking on the animal to make sure it's down without his gun? Why did he place it against a tree and then walk 70 feet over to this animal that if it's not dead, it poses an enormous threat to you? You're all alone and unarmed with a huge bear that you've shot? No one's gonna do that. You're gonna carry your gun. But even if all of that happened, that Carl, unarmed, approached this bear thinking it was dead, but the bear's not dead, he's lying in wait and he leaps up and attacks Carl, even if that happened, black bears don't squeeze people to death. They might scratch you and bite you and rip you to pieces, but they don't squeeze you to death. And Carl only had light scratching on his wrists and on his hands. He did not have any signs of a traditional bear attack. So, either this is the first time in the history of black bears that a black bear squeezed a person to death, or something else squeezed Carl. But what kind of an animal is, one, so strong it can squeeze a man's chest to the point where it breaks his ribs, and two, happens to be roaming around the Bennington Triangle? Makes you wonder.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Incommunicado. On the morning of August 18th, 2018, A 41-year-old man named Vladimir Kostenko stepped out of a taxi onto a desolate road in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles and miles from civilization. All he had with him were his cell phone, a solar-powered charger for his phone, and a backpack that contained some clothes and 5 pounds of oatmeal. Vladimir bent down and leaned into the taxi to pay the taxi driver, and as he was doing that, the driver looked up at him and just said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And Vladimir just smiled and nodded and said, "Yep, I'm going to be just fine. Don't worry about me." Now, the taxi driver did not really buy this and just looked at Vladimir like he was completely insane. But Vladimir wasn't shocked. I mean, this is kind of how everybody reacted to him when he told them about this trip he was doing into the wilderness. When he had brought it up to his family the first time, they and all of their family friends had basically rallied together to try to stop Vladimir from going on this trip. It was way too dangerous. But Vladimir said, "Guys, I'm going. You can't stop me. I'm doing this. It's important to me." And at that point, when, the family and friends knew they couldn't change his mind, they shifted and said, well, at least, bring a gun or bear spray or something to protect yourself. But Vladimir also refused that too. He said, "Nope, I don't need any of that because the only thing I need is God. God is going to protect me." So Vladimir was extremely religious. He actually had left his home country, Russia, when he was in his early 20s because he was being persecuted for his Christian beliefs. And so now, in the United States, he lived out in Washington state and basically lived his life like a monk. I mean, he spent the majority of his time, basically praying and meditating and reading religious books, and he would often go on these multi-day long fasts. He did work part-time as a mechanic, but he rarely charged his clients when he did work. And then even when he did charge them, he was working so few hours that the money he was making was totally unsubstantial. But again, the way Vladimir looked at this is he didn't need money because ultimately God would take care of him. But despite all of his fasting and his praying and, his generosity, lately Vladimir had been feeling really lost. He did feel deeply spiritual, but at the same time, he didn't really feel fulfilled. He felt like he was missing purpose in his life, and it was really starting to bother him. And so it was around this time that Vladimir decided to go on this big trip. One of Vladimir's family friends was this guy named Dmitry Kudrin, and he owned this small cabin way out in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Now, Dmitry didn't use this cabin very much, but he kept it in great shape. It was fully furnished, there was a wood-burning stove inside, and the pantry was stocked with 3 years' supply of food. And so at some point, when Vladimir and Dmitry were talking, and Vladimir talked about feeling sort of lost and wanting to reconnect with his spirituality and find his purpose in life, well, at some point, Dmitry said, well, hey, if you want, you can go use my cabin and sort of disconnect from society and go retreat out there and sort of focus on yourself and sort of get right with the world. You're welcome to go out there anytime you want. You can stay out there as long as you want and for free, no problem. And Vladimir had happily accepted. And now here he was, standing on this desolate road in the Alaskan wilderness, watching as the taxi driver drove away, except he wasn't even close to the cabin. I mean, he was in the middle of nowhere already, but he still had to go 14 more miles with no trail to make his way to this cabin. But Vladimir was so excited, he really felt like this was the thing he needed to figure out his purpose in life. And so he put his backpack on, took a deep breath, and began to hike. Three months later, on November 3rd of 2018, Dmitry, Vladimir's friend who owned this cabin, found himself in his plane flying over the area roughly where his cabin was. And Dmitry was feeling very concerned. So obviously, Dmitry suggested Vladimir go out and use this cabin, and so he was totally open to the idea of it. But Dmitry had also told Vladimir that when he went out there, he really ought to bring a gun with him. Or if nothing else, at least some bear spray or something to protect himself, because this is truly the wild. You are not the top of the food chain anymore, and you want to be able to protect yourself. But Vladimir had said no, he would not be going with any sort of weaponry, that, God was going to look after him and he'd be fine. And Dmitry's like, that's a bad plan, but he just could not convince Vladimir to change his mind. And so ultimately, Dmitry sort of regretted even suggesting this idea because he didn't expect Vladimir to go unarmed. But he felt like, it's already in motion. And so he told Vladimir, okay, fine, do your thing, but when you're out there, I need you to communicate with me regularly so I know you're okay. and Vladimir promised he would. And at first, that is exactly what happened. Vladimir, made the 14-mile hike from where he was dropped by the taxi. He got to the cabin, he got all set up, and then just about every other day or every few days, he would hike up this nearby mountain where there was cell phone service, and he would update Dmitri. He would tell him that things were going great, he was spending lots of time meditating and praying, and he was foraging for berries, and there was this pesky squirrel that kept coming in and stealing his food, so he was trying to figure out what to do with the squirrel, but clearly, things were going fine, and Vladimir appeared to be safe. However, after 6 weeks of Vladimir being at this cabin, those pretty regular updates just abruptly stopped. Now, at first, Dmitri kind of chalked it up as like, well, I've been talking to him for weeks. There didn't appear to be any, burgeoning crises or anything going on in his life that might warrant some concern. He's a capable guy, maybe because it's the Alaskan winter and Alaskan winters are notoriously dark. There's not a lot of sunlight. Maybe his solar-powered charger isn't working. He can't get enough sunlight, so he can't charge his phone. And so maybe that's what it is. He just can't contact me because his phone doesn't turn on. Basically, Dmitri was coming up with these sort of rationales for why he wasn't hearing from his friend. But as the days went on and Dmitri still didn't hear from Vladimir, he couldn't help but start to feel like something's wrong here. And so finally, in early November, when Dmitri still had not heard from Vladimir, it's been about a month since those text messages stopped, Dmitri decided to get into his plane and fly out over the area where this cabin was and literally look down and see if his friend was down there in the cabin. Also, this gave Dmitri the opportunity to put some supplies on the plane in these big buckets that he could literally throw out down to Vladimir to also restock him. So Dmitri is now in his plane and he's circling around the area where his cabin is. But this cabin is really small and it's sort of in this big sea of trees. There's nothing else for miles. And so it's pretty difficult with the naked eye to actually look out and see his own cabin. But Dmitri had this camera on the underside of his plane that he could maneuver and look all around, and he had this screen that he could see from the cockpit that was basically an enhanced view of the ground down below. It was a lot easier to see, for example, his cabin. And so as he was circling, he's moving the camera around, and then bam, he sees right in the middle of his screen is his cabin. And there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with the cabin. It all looks good. There's smoke coming up out of the chimney. And as he's circling, he's thinking, okay, Vladimir clearly is going to hear me. He's going to come outside and I'll see that he's okay. And sure enough, as he's circling around, Dmitri sees on his screen that the front door of the cabin opens and his friend Vladimir walks right outside onto the porch. He puts his hands on his hips and he looks up and he waves at Dmitri. And there's this moment of clear recognition, like obviously Vladimir knows this is Dmitri coming to check on him, and Vladimir's down there kind of gesticulating that, hey, everything's fine, I'm good, sorry about the phone thing, or, Dmitri didn't know what he was doing, but it just sort of seemed like, okay, there's recognition here, that it's been a month, but everything is fine. And so Dmitri got down nice and low and continued to circle, and on one of his passes over the cabin, he pulled a lever, dropped the supplies, those buckets of supplies, they landed down below, and then as Dmitri continued to circle, he watched on the camera as Vladimir walked up and put his hands on the supplies and waved again to Dmitri, sort of signaling, thank you for the supplies. And at that point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, Vladimir's just fine, everything's good, I can go home. And so that's what he did. Now, he would have landed and gone and seen Vladimir up close, but, there wasn't anywhere to land anywhere nearby. Like, this was the closest he could get to Vladimir, and so he decided this was enough. So Dmitri, he turned around and he headed home. But about 2 months later, on December 23rd, Dmitri was once again in his plane flying over the area where his cabin was. Because over these last 2 months, he continued not to get any text messages or any communication from Vladimir, which, that was bad. He sort of expected that given that Dmitri flew out there before and they clearly recognized like, hey, are you good? There was sort of a moment of recognition that Dmitri's checking in on Vladimir because of the silence. That's what Dmitri's thinking. Maybe that would inspire Vladimir to find a way to send out communications now, like let Dmitri know he's okay. But he hadn't for 2 months. And so Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's bad. Also, it's now December, and the winter in Alaska is full bore. Tons of snow on the ground, it's frigid temperatures, it is truly brutal winter conditions. And then lastly, there had also just been this major earthquake in the area where Dmitri's cabin was. And so all those things combined made Dmitri think, okay, I better get out there and just check on Vladimir again. And so once again, Dmitri is circling low over the area where his cabin is. He's got his camera trained towards the ground and he's moving it around as he's circling, and eventually he finds his cabin. And his cabin is clearly in one piece, so the earthquake did not destroy his cabin, but there's no sign of Vladimir anywhere. But then again, this is just the first second he's seen the cabin. He's only been in the area for a couple of minutes now. Maybe Vladimir has not heard the plane yet. And so, Dmitri's not lost hope. And he continues to circle. And as he's circling, he drops these supply buckets that land right out in front of the cabin. And at this point, Dmitri's thinking, okay, that's pretty noisy, having these supply buckets smash into the ground outside. Certainly now Vladimir is going to come outside to see what's going on. I mean, there's not much else happening. This clearly is something that would draw his attention. But no, nobody comes out of the cabin. And so at this point, Dmitri gets as low as he possibly can, and he's got his camera trained right at the cabin. And as he's doing another pass, he realizes something. There's no smoke coming out of the chimney. In fact, the top of the chimney is covered with snow, which means clearly no fire has been lit, at least not recently. And so Dmitri starts to panic. If anybody was in that cabin right now without a fire lit, it would be so cold, they would likely freeze to death really quickly. This is a crisis. What's going on with Vladimir? But Dmitri couldn't land anywhere nearby. There was no way for him to really get down to this cabin. So he had to fly all the way to the nearest airport. And then once he touched down, he immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers to report his friend missing, because that was the only thing he could think to do. However, after Dmitri made this report, the state troopers didn't launch some huge search for Vladimir. And that's in part because they weren't actually sure he was missing. They understood that Dmitri, after flying out over the area, had seen snow on the chimney cap and, it's really cold out, nobody could survive without a fire. And also, he flew over the area, dropped supplies, and Vladimir didn't come out of the cabin. How could he not hear that stuff? They understood that. But they're also thinking it's possible Vladimir just might not have been in the area. Maybe he was out hunting or, foraging for food or whatever he was doing, and maybe he just wasn't in the area. And that's why it gave you the impression that he was missing. And so that was one part of it. And the other part is the weather was atrocious in this part of the world. And so just sending out a search party into the terrible weather out into the wilderness was really risky. And so the troopers thought it just wasn't worth doing this big search. And so instead of launching a big search, the troopers told Dmitri that what they were going to do instead is just comb through airline records, local airline records, to see if maybe a Vladimir Kostenko had, taken off and flown out of the area. Maybe he didn't tell Dmitri and he just left. Maybe that's why he's not there. And this really frustrated Dmitri and the rest of Vladimir's family, because they're all looking at this as a true emergency. And they're thinking, there's no way he just hopped on a plane and flew out of here without telling anyone. And so finally, 3 days after filing this missing person report, Dmitri said, enough is enough. I'm going to just take it into my own hands and go out there myself and see what's going on with Vladimir. So he chartered a private helicopter and he flew out to the cabin. And when he got there, he gets off the helicopter and he just scans the property. And he sees, this little cabin, and there's, firewood outside stacked up with snow all over it. There's loads of snow on the cabin, and there's snow kind of drifted up on the front door, making it seem like nobody's come in or out of this cabin for some time. And, Dmitri, he's looking around for Vladimir, but there's no sign of life anywhere. Dmitri calls out for Vladimir, but there's no response. And so, with some level of trepidation, Dmitri begins walking up towards his cabin. And when he gets close enough to the front door, he notices something weird. He sees that the front door of this cabin has clearly been boarded up from the outside. There's this big piece of metal that's been placed, basically blocking the door, so nobody could go inside of it. And so Dmitri's thinking, why would you do this unless you were leaving the cabin? But why would Vladimir leave the cabin? Where is he? I don't understand what's going on here. And so Dmitri goes up to this piece of metal and pries it off the front door. And then he swings open the front door and he looks inside, and everything is pristine. Vladimir is not inside, but the cabin looks immaculate. There's still firewood, there's still food, there's no sign of chaos, no sign of any struggle whatsoever, everything looks exactly like it should. And so Dmitri, he began walking around inside of this cabin, looking for any clue as to what happened to Vladimir. But there was nothing, until he got to the firewood. He noticed that clearly Vladimir had been labeling his firewood. There was one piece of firewood in particular where the writing was very clear, and what it said was, frankincense aroma, do not burn. And so Dimitri's looking at this piece of wood, that's been labeled as something that he shouldn't be burning. And he's looking at other pieces of wood that also have some level of labeling on them. And he's thinking, like, what does that mean? I don't understand that at all. But that was it. There was no other clues about where Vladimir had gone. And even the labeling of the wood, like, that didn't give him anything. And so the impression that Dimitri got after seeing this firsthand was that at some point, Vladimir, for reasons completely unknown, just decided to board up the cabin and disappear into the Alaskan wilderness with basically no protection, no clear sign he even brought food with him. He just got up and left. Friends and family, and even some authorities, believe there is a chance he could still be out there somewhere. In fact, at one point, authorities thought they had found Vladimir in Hawaii. It turned out not to be him. And then again, they thought they found him in Oregon. It turned out not to be him as well. But the case is still open, and authorities think, at least some do, that he might be alive somewhere, but nobody knows where. And so at this point, all the family has to go off of is the final image of Vladimir, which was taken from inside of Dimitri's plane when he did that first flyover, and he saw Vladimir come out on the porch. That is the final image of Vladimir that we know of. We don't know what happened after this image. All we know is, at some point he began labeling his firewood, writing down which aroma the wood makes, and then he boarded his place up and he left. But where he went next is still a mystery.
You ever love something that hurts you gently? Yeah, the kind. You said my name like it was safe to stay. Soft tone hiding what you take away. Your smile felt warm, your silence was cold. I learned your truth and the things you didn't hold. I'll read your eyes like a warning sign. Still cross the line every single time. You touch my scars like you knew the code. Then blame my heart for the weight you broke. I called it love, it felt like gravity pulling me down, but it felt like death.
Paper lantern dreams drift above the silent streets tonight, glowing with the secrets that we whispered in the fading light.
The world is holding still, as if it knows the things we never said, while every fragile hope floats like a flame above.
A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.